Halina Kowalski fed 8 children on one steelworker's paycheck for 25 years. One paycheck. 6 tin envelopes in a row on a shelf in a row house on Polish Hill, and a brown notebook she wrote in every Friday for 62 years. I have that notebook on the second shelf of my study. People say now that you cannot raise a family on a single wage anymore, that something was lost. They are right, but it was not the wage. Stanislav Kowalski's mill pay was never large, never enough on paper. What made it enough was the 30 things Halina did with the money before the money knew where it was going. The envelopes, the Friday count, the funeral fund, the $2 she sent home to her sister in Poland in the worst year of her life. A whole architecture built by a woman who could not read English, written in pencil in a language a Polish priest had to translate for me in 1995. I'm going to read you that notebook. 30 practices the American working class ran on through the 1950s and into the 1960s before they were forgotten. I promise you the page. But first, you have to understand the house. The skills make no sense outside it, and the house is gone, and I am one of the few people left who sat in it. So stay with me. Sit down for a while. This is not a lecture, and I'm not selling you anything. It is a notebook written by a real woman who is no longer here, and I am reading it aloud the way she asked me to. While you listen, think of one woman in your own family who ran a household on less than seemed possible. And tell me, when you have a moment, whose notebook do you have on a shelf in your house? Or whose do you wish you had kept? Now, come up the hill. Polish Hill in 1955 was a steep climb of brick row houses with the spires of St. Stanislaus standing over all of it. And Halina's kitchen was at the top of a set of wooden stairs that smelled of cabbage and coal smoke and the bread she baked on Saturdays. My mother was her nurse first. Vera went into that house starting in 1953, and she brought me along when I was 7, after school, on Saturdays, carrying the black leather bag. So I knew Halina before I understood a single thing about her. I knew her kitchen. I knew the kettle that was always on. I knew the shelf by the window where the 6 envelopes sat, and I knew not to touch them, the way you know not to touch an altar. She called the notebook the Zeshit, the Friday book. It sat on that same shelf for 62 years, and every Friday afternoon, when Stanislav brought home the pay, Halina took down the bucket and the book, and she sat at the table and she did the week. Not in her head, on paper. Every penny that came in, every penny that went out, and a small note in the margin, 1 line, sometimes only 2 words, about what the week had taught her. I can still see the table she did it at. It was covered with an oilcloth printed with little blue flowers, worn pale white in a half circle, where her forearm had rested for 40 years. There was a geranium in a coffee tin on the windowsill that she kept alive through every Pittsburgh winter on a sill that got 2 hours of sun. None of that is in the notebook. I only know it because I was there, a girl doing her own schoolwork at the end of that same table, while 2 grown women talked over my head in 2 languages. That is the thing about these books. They hold the numbers. They do not hold the geranium. I am the geranium's only witness now, and so I am telling you. The pencil she used was a flat carpenter's pencil, the kind Stanislav brought home from the mill, and she sharpened it with a paring knife. She wrote small. She wrote the way a woman writes who has decided that paper is not free either. And when the week was hard, she did not write more. She wrote the same. The columns did not know the difference between a Good Friday and a terrible one. That was on purpose, though I did not understand it for 30 years. The first skill is the one nobody names anymore, because it sounds too simple to matter. She wrote it down, all of it. There was a woman who wrote to me last spring and said she had finally started keeping a paper book of her household money after 30 years of doing it on a screen, and that the paper had changed something she could not explain. I knew exactly what she meant. Halina knew it in 1924. The writing was not the record. The writing was the relationship. A woman who writes down every grosse on a Friday afternoon is a woman who is never surprised by her own life on a Monday. The second skill was the bucket itself. The pay came home as cash, and it never went into Halina's purse or Stanislav's pocket. It went into the bucket on the table, and then it came out of the bucket and into the envelopes that same evening before anyone slept. Money that is divided the day it arrives cannot be spent twice. That is the whole of it. The envelopes were the 3rd through the 8th skills, and I am going to open every one of them for you, but not yet. I promised you the page, and I will give you the page in its time. For now, understand the rhythm. Friday was the count. Saturday was the baking and the markets. Sunday was Kościół, the church, St. Stanislaus, the whole hill walking up the same stairs at the same hour, and the week turned on that every week for 62 years. The discipline was not a budget. A budget is a number. This was a calendar. The money had a day, and the day had a meaning, and the meaning held the money in place. Stanisław worked at Jones and Laughlin, down the hill on the Monongahela, the mill they called J&L, in the open hearth where the air was a thing you could chew. One paycheck. That is the part the modern version of this story always gets wrong. People imagine a golden age when one wage was generous. It was not generous. It was one wage, and it was thin, and it bought a family of 10 its survival only because the woman at the top of those stairs had turned thinness into a system. Now, to understand the system, you have to understand what was around it, because Halina did not build it alone, and neither did any of these women. They built it on top of something. The hill itself was a financial instrument, and almost nobody tells you that. Every house on Polish Hill had a funeral fund. That was the 9th skill, and it was not optional, and it was not private. You did not die owing the parish. Halina kept an envelope for it from the year she married, and that money was sacred. It sat there, never opened, never borrowed against, for one purpose. Because a funeral on the hill was not a private grief. It was a communal expense, and a widow left owing the undertaker and the church was a shame the whole street felt. St. Stanislaus stood over all of them, and the parish kept its accounts the way the women kept theirs, to the penny and on time. So they each carried the small weight of it all the time, so that none of them would carry the large weight of it alone. And when Stanislav died in 1956 of his lungs, 54 years old, after 25 years in that open hearth, Halina did not face the cost alone. She had the fund. The undertaker was paid, the parish was paid, and she owed no one. And she had something more, the 10th skill, the one I think about most. After the mill killed a man on Polish Hill, the widows came. There was a circle of them. They pooled money, quietly, to cover the funeral and the first hard months for whichever woman had just been widowed. 11 of them in 1957, the year Helena counted. Never fewer than 6. They had no name for it that you would find in a bank. It was just what the women did. And Helena, who had been on the receiving end of it in 56, spent the next 30 years on the giving end of it. There is a name for what those women built. The economists, when they finally noticed it, called it social capital or female mutual aid. The women called it the circle. They built a private welfare state out of envelopes and $2 contributions, decades before this country built any of its own, with no charter, no office, no salary, on the strength of knowing each other's kitchens. That is the 11th skill, and it cannot be bought. It can only be belonged to. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make Stanislav the villain of his own death, the man who let the mill take his lungs. He was not careless. Stanislav Kowalski was a man who had been handed exactly one option: feed 8 children or quit and feed none of them. The mill knew that. The mill priced his lungs accordingly, the way it priced every man's lungs on that hill, because it knew the men had nowhere else to go. There was a name for what the air did to them. They called it the black lung in the neighborhood. The mill called it nothing at all for 40 years. The settlement, when it finally came in 1969, came too late to do Helena any good. By then she had already built her own settlement, envelope by envelope, Friday by Friday. She had not waited for the mill to be fair. She had assumed it never would be, and she had been right. There was another woman who ran a household like this in those same years, 2 neighborhoods over, in Bloomfield, where the Italians were. Her name was Rosa DiMaggio. I sat in her kitchen for 14 years, later, after Helena's time, and I tell you the 2 women never met, but they were running the same machine in 2 different languages. Rosa's husband Antonio laid brick and stone across Bloomfield and Lawrenceville on 1 labourer's wage, and Rosa fed 6 children on it, and her notebook was a recipe and money book. Every dish followed by the cost of what went into it and the day of the week it was cheapest to buy. 1 chicken, 4 meals. A garden out back that put up 60% of the vegetables by 1932, and a ledger that tracked the value of every tomato she did not have to buy. Different food, different church, the same exact discipline. I will tell Rosa's whole story another day. I bring her up now only so you understand. This was not one remarkable Polish woman. This was a generation of women across every hill in this city, running one wage like a small economy, because they had no other choice, and because they were extraordinarily good at it. So, now I will open the envelopes. This is the page I promised you. 6 tin envelopes, skills 12 through 17, and then the rules that govern them carry all the way to 30. I have read this part of the book 100 times. I am going to read it the way Helena laid it out. The first envelope was the rent. It came out first the night the pay came home, before anything else. Skill 12. Pay the roof before you pay yourself. Whatever else went short, the rent envelope was full before the bucket emptied. The second envelope was the church, the parish, the funeral dues, the Sunday offering, all set aside the same Friday night. Skill 13. She did not give what was left at the end of the week. She gave first, off the top, and lived on the rest. Everyone I ever watched do this prospered in a way the people who gave last never did, And I do not fully understand why, but I have stopped doubting it. The third envelope was the funeral fund I told you about, the one you do not touch ever, the one that made her a free woman the week her husband died. Skill 14. The fourth envelope was the children's shoes, and it had its own rule, Skill 15, the shoe rule. Every child's shoes were bought half a size too big and stuffed at the toe with folded newspaper, so the child grew into them across 2 winters instead of 1. She did not buy shoes that fit. She bought shoes the child would grow to fit. 8 children, 25 years, and the shoe envelope held on one decision about newspaper. The fifth envelope was the wedding fund, and here is Skill 16, the one that undoes people when I read it aloud. Each daughter's wedding fund was started the year that daughter was born, not when she was engaged, the year she was born. A few groschen a week into a tin for 18 years, and by the time the girl stood at St. Stanislaus in a dress, the money had been waiting since the week she drew her first breath. That is not budgeting. That is faith, kept in tin. And the sixth envelope she called the bad week. Skill 17. It was the emergency fund, but she did not call it emergency, because emergency means surprise, and Helena did not believe in surprises. The bad week was not a possibility. It was a certainty that had not arrived yet, and she funded it like a bill she already owed. The rule on it, Skill 18, was that the only thing that could open it was a real one. The mill cutting hours, a child sick, the coal running short in February, not a want, not a sale. And when she opened it, the very next Friday she began filling it again, before anything but the rent and the church, because the next one was always coming. The envelopes were only the structure. The skills that made the structure live come next. Skill 19 was the market route. She walked 3 markets every week, knew which one marked down meat on which day, and planned her walking by the marked-down calendar, not by what was nearest. Skill 20 she bought to the season and the sale, never to the craving. Skill 21 she cooked the cheap thing 4 ways so the family never knew it was the cheap thing. Kapusta and kielbasa stretched across a week until the next pay. Skill 22, nothing was thrown out. The bones became the stock, the stale bread the thickener. Skill 23, she put up food in the fall to draw down through the winter, so that February, the cruelest month for a Steele family, was met from the pantry and not from the thin envelope. Skill 24 was the remittance, and it is the one that tells you who she was. Every month, for 30 years, Helena sent $2 home to her sister in Poland. It does not sound like a sacrifice until you understand what $2 was against 8 children on 1 mill wage. Skill 25 was the rule on that envelope. The remittance was never opened in a bad week. The bad week envelope could be emptied. The remittance could not. In 1932, when J and L cut the men's pay to the bone and the whole hill went hungry, Helena sent the $2. I have the line. It is there in the margin, in pencil, the same as every other month, with not one dramatic word beside it. She just sent it. There was a woman a few doors down, Antonina, I will not give you her whole story tonight, who did the same with a sister back home, and the 2 of them walked to the post office together on the first Saturday of the month for 40 years. 2 widows eventually, mailing money across an ocean to women they would never see again. The household was never bounded by the house. They had made grief and love into a fixed expense, and they paid it the way you pay the rent. I have to tell you something I'm not proud of. For the first years I went into that house, I thought the envelopes were superstition. I had a nursing degree. I had read about household finance in textbooks, and I looked at 6 tin envelopes on a windowsill and thought, this poor woman does not know about a savings account. I thought the system was charming. I used that word in my own head, the way you describe a quilt. It took me until I was 65, until my own Thomas had died and I had to build a widow's budget from nothing, to understand that Helena had not been charming. She had been right. I had condescended for 30 years to the most resilient household economy I have ever seen, because it was written in pencil by a woman who could not read English. She understood money. I was the one who did not. The last skills are the ones that are hardest to see, because they are not about a tin or a market day. Skill 26 was that the husband never touched the bucket. Stanisław handed the pay over and never counted it again, not because he was kept from it, but because they had agreed, without ever saying it, that the household was her trade the way the open hearth was his. Skill 27 was that the children were taught the system by being given the smallest envelope to run by the time they were 10, real grosse, real consequences, so that the knowledge would not die with her. Skill 28 was that she never borrowed against next week. The week was a wall, and you lived inside this week's wall, not next week's. Skill 29 was that every windfall, a settlement, a gift, a good year, went into the funds and never into the living, so that the standard of life never rose to meet the good year and then crash when it ended. The good year filled the envelopes. The good year did not buy a better sofa. And Skill 30. Skill 30 is the one that holds the other 29 together, and it is the one I could not have named when I was young, because I did not yet know it was a skill. Skill 30 is that she did the count every Friday, whether the news was good or bad. She did not skip the bad Fridays. The week the pay was cut, she counted. The week Stanisław died, the notebook has an entry, the hand shaky, the numbers small, but there. She never once let herself not look. The 30th skill is simply this. She never stopped keeping the book. It was the return, every Friday, to the table, to the truth of the week, for 62 years. That is the wealth they built on a single paycheck. Not money, the unbroken habit of facing the money. Everything else grew out of that. The notebook ends in 1986. The last entries are short. The hand is barely the same hand that started it in 1924, but it is keeping the same columns in the same order, rent and church and the bad week, to the last Friday she could hold a pencil. She was 83 when she stopped. She was 4 years older then than I am now. Helena died in 1987. I didn't get the notebook until 1991, when her daughter-in-law brought it to me and said, "My mother-in-law wrote in this every Friday for 60 years, and I can't read Polish, and she asked that you have it." I had it translated by a priest at St. Stanislaus, and the day he handed me the English of it, I read the whole 62 years in one afternoon, and understood at last what I had been too young and too educated to see. Rosa DiMaggio in Bloomfield kept her version until 1989, and she handed it to me before she died for the same reason. Because her daughters did not read the dialect it was written in, and the knowledge would have gone into a dumpster otherwise. 2 women, 2 languages, 2 hills, the same 30 skills, the same single wage turned into a life. Neither thought she was doing anything remarkable. Each thought she was simply keeping house. That was the whole genius of it. They did not know it was extraordinary, so they never stopped. If you have a grandmother who could make $1 do the work of 3, this is who she was. If there is a woman in your family whose hands you remember counting at a kitchen table on a certain day of the week, this is what she was doing. If you have ever wondered how the people before you raised 6 children, 8 children, on a wage that on paper could not have done it, this is how. It was never the size of the paycheck. It was the 30 things they did with it before it could get away. The wage is not what we lost. What we lost is the Friday, the table, the return. You can have it back. It was never patented and it was never sold. It is in the notebook on my shelf, and now a little of it is in you. They are gone now. What they knew is yours.